So the title of today's panel is Faculty Fretting. It's an opportunity we have to tap into expertise here on campus as they think about events and developments in their particular area of expertise, whether the area might be regional or it might be disciplinary, and really to try to sort of share with the rest of us what's on their mind, what are they worried about in terms of their particular area of expertise. And so we have three experts here that will help shed some light on some really important regions of the world: Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. All three hail from BYU's Department of History: Professor Leslie Hadfield, Professor Christine Isom-Verhaaren, and Professor Evan Ward. And so we will turn the time over to them, and each of them will briefly discuss some short-term, immediate things that they're worried about, some longer-term ones, and each of them I've encouraged to make at least one prediction. And then after they do that, we'll give them an opportunity to discuss if any of their issues that they've discussed speak to each other, maybe across regions. And then once that takes place, we'll turn the time open to the audience for discussion, question, and answers. And so we'll turn the time over to first Professor Hadfield.
All right. Thank you for having me. Make sure this microphone is capturing my voice. I just want to make sure that you all have in mind that these are just my ideas. I'm not going to be totally comprehensive. Africa is a huge continent, and there are a lot of other people who might have different ideas. Mine are more political in nature and have to do with recent events, so they're really tied to what I see as the most significant immediate issues that are facing Africa at this point, if we take it as a whole. And I think in my view, the political transitions that we're seeing now are really important. Some of them we're still not sure what direction they're going to go into. And one of the reasons why I see them as pretty important and the most significant immediate issues is that good governance and a strong civil society are important for other aspects of society to develop or to be stable. And so that's what I'm looking at there. So we have a number of places where there have been some political transitions. Again, not sure where some of them are going. Today in the news we hear, or hopefully you've heard, that in Kenya we have Raila Odinga, who held his own. He lost the elections against Uhuru Kenyatta last year in August. He said, no, there were some problems there, so they called for a re-election, and the Supreme Court of Kenya said that there were indeed some problems. The agency who was supposed to be monitoring the elections didn't follow all of its protocol, and so they had a runoff election, and because of things that Odinga thought were not quite right, he actually boycotted those elections. So then Uhuru Kenyatta, he won by even a greater percentage. And so Odinga, in a way, there have been petitions to the Supreme Court since then. Today, or I guess I should say yesterday, I think it was yesterday. Well, actually, I'm not sure what the time difference, but he held his own inauguration, so this mock inauguration to say, I am the president of the country, I am the people's choice. And because that was happening, the state froze news agencies that were going to be broadcasting this on the news, on TV. So it was a blackout, media blackout. So that's really something to be watching and worried about. The state of democracy in Kenya, it has been fraught, partly with some ethnic rivalries, but also political big men, as we call them in African politics. So that's happening in Zimbabwe. Maybe you heard in the news a big change happened there. Robert Mugabe, who is in power for over 30 years, he's in his 90s. There was a tense kind of rivalry between his vice president, Emerson Mnangagwa, and Mugabe's wife, Grace Mugabe, who was trying to become the next president. Then Mnangagwa was fired. Anyway, the army took over. Mugabe finally resigned after so many years. And Mnangagwa is now the president of Zimbabwe, starting to opening things up, but people his nickname is the crocodile. And so people are saying maybe this is not going to be better than Mugabe. So a lot of questions there. South Africa, Jacob Zuma is no longer the president of the African National Congress, and there's going to be elections soon, so things are changing there. The Democratic Republic of the Congo is another place where Joseph Kabila, who's been in power for a while, they keep postponing elections. So all of these things are things to be looking for or watching in Africa, and they are concerning, like I said, because if you have good governance and a strong civil society and democracy entrenched, then that paves the way for other things, better things to happen. And so some of those longer term issues that I want to highlight are some environmental and economic stability issues. So in the news lately, also, we've heard that South Africa has had a drought, and Cape Town is saying we're going to turn off the water. So there are a lot of things in Namibia. This drought has, in particular areas, I know from a colleague who works in Namibia, said most of the livestock of the Himba people have died in the last few years. So this is a major issue. And I think of the late Wangari Maathai, who was the first African woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize, and how much she said, if we really want our societies to be healthy, the environment needs to be healthy. And this is tied to economic issues when you have a lot of mining going on in these areas, and many of them are areas where we see conflicts, and that's not a coincidence. It is because of this resource management, and how is the agricultural sector being developed in conjunction with the urban sectors, and those two things need to go in hand. So those are some more longer term significant issues. The terrorism is also an issue in a number of places. Boko Haram is probably one of the most famous, and you've got the problems in Somalia. Those are also tied to what I think is a concern is U.S.-Africa relations, the U.S. being one of the more powerful countries. China has also moved in a little bit less showy way, but they're definitely there economically, and so those are two things. But in particular, because we're in the United States, I'm interested in, of course, the way that President Trump has characterized African nations and how Africans migrate to the U.S. is indicative of how he sees the continent. And I think I'm concerned about how, with that view and with terrorism being an issue that people bring up, that the U.S.-Africa relations will continue to be militarized, and that it will be, the military will have the presence there. It will be more of a military discussion or relationship rather than let's go with diplomacy that has less to do with arms. So the last thing I will say is kind of a significant long-term issue that we've been battling for a long time is how Africa is viewed and treated by the rest of the world. Until Africa is viewed as a partner and seen as equal, and this is not just by people like who share some of the views that President Trump does about African countries, but it's also by people who go for mission, to say missions, and I'm not talking just about LDS missions, but mission trips and voluntourism, NGOs, the way that they also depict Africa can be damaging as well. We need to really support and promote African leadership, innovation, and entrepreneurship, and see them as partners. I've had a hard time coming up with a prediction. I'm an optimist, but that makes me not want to say that things are going to implode in Zimbabwe or other places, but I do think there are a number of places to watch, and I think we'll see probably the DRC is going to continue in a similar vein. I don't think that there's going to be major changes there. I'm hoping in South Africa the ANC will clean up its act a bit with Cyril Ramaphosa now as the head of the ANC. But I'm also afraid that we might see some things get worse before they get better in places like Zimbabwe and Kenya. And also I think Rwanda is a place to watch. Kagame's been in power for a long time. We've got Museveni in Uganda as well. So there are some things to watch there. And I will finish.
So when I was asked to participate in this panel, I was like, well, the most significant immediate issue in the Middle East. I have many choices, but I didn't want to make my choice too soon. And so I waited a while, and I've chosen Operation Olive Branch, I love that name, which is the name of Turkey's invasion of northern Syria to capture Afrin, which began on January 20th and is now in day 12. And I thought this was particularly appropriate for this semester, which is dealing with the issues of borders and migration, because that's really what we're talking about here, borders and refugees. So the borders between Turkey and Syria were set after World War I, generally reflecting the wishes of Britain and France, so quite arbitrary, but they've basically been in place for almost a century. And one group that was promised in kind of a vague way that they would get either autonomy or a state were the Kurds, but this was never implemented. The Kurds, especially in Turkey, are a very significant proportion of the population, and they have experienced a great deal of discrimination unless they assimilate. If they assimilate, then there isn't a problem, but if they want to keep speaking Kurdish and follow Kurdish customs, then they have experienced discrimination. So there has been fighting between the PKK, which the Turks consider a terrorist organization, and Turkish government forces, which has been going on for decades. So with the Syrian civil war, this has complicated regional issues that have been ongoing for many years. And certainly in the case of Turkey and the Kurds, this is the case, because the Turks are very afraid of having an independent Kurdish political entity on their southern border. So Turkey has invaded Syria with this, and I have my map great up here, with the support of the Free Syrian Army against the Syrian Kurdish organization, the YPG, which is supported by the US, and has been the most effective of the local forces against ISIS. And Russia is also involved in this. Turkey would never have invaded without the tacit approval of Russia, even though publicly Russia has condemned this. Part of the migratory issue of this is that Turkey plans to settle Syrian refugees now living in Turkey in this area if the invasion is successful. So this is an effort that is similar to what the Ottomans would do when they would move populations around to prevent unrest. And so it'll be very interesting to see how successful Turkey is in its military operations in Syria and also the diplomacy that's going on. So as far as ongoing issues in the Middle East, also many, I thought I would focus on authoritarian governments which cannot be replaced despite massive popular support for their overthrow. And of course, a perfect example of this is Syria, which after almost 7 years of civil war, the Assad regime is winning with the help of Iran and Russia. And although the majority of the population in Syria do not support his government, many factors enable authoritarian regimes in the Middle East to stay in power. One of these is the fact that the states are not dependent on taxation for their revenues, and in fact, they have a lot of economic power in their states because they rely on, in a lot of cases, either directly on oil revenues or indirectly on oil revenues. So the Syrian civil war, at this point, it's hard to get any accurate figures, has killed approximately 500,000 people, displaced 11 million both inside and outside the country, worsened a refugee crisis in Europe, contributing to the rise of populism in Europe. So that is a major ongoing concern. A few years ago, with the so-called Arab Spring, it looked like there might be some progress in this area, but so far the results have been pretty negative. As far as a prediction, I think I will go with that of Ryan Crocker, the former U.S. ambassador to Syria and Iraq, who spoke about 2 years ago at BYU. I don't know if any of you were here for his speech. What he basically said was, look around and enjoy the moment because it's going to get worse. And I would have to agree that the way things looked 2 years ago was a good deal brighter than the way they look right now. One of the relatively bright spots in the Middle East was Turkey, which is getting dimmer at a pretty fast clip. If you look at the various democracy indexes, which various organizations issue. In one of them, Turkey has lost like 15 points, which is pretty dramatic in the last year. Another country with serious problems is when rating countries from 1 to 100, Syria is a -1, which seems to be quite an accomplishment to be able to get into the negative numbers. Turkey is still under a state of emergency from its July 2016 coup, with thousands of academics, journalists, judges, and other civil servants being imprisoned or losing their jobs. So I can't come up with I'm not a pessimist by nature, but I can't come up with an optimistic prediction.
Well, thanks to the Kennedy Center and Professor Larson for organizing today's panel. I'd like to start by observing that the narrow focus of the media on a small handful of topics in Latin America is something that generally makes me fret. And I had a screenshot that I wanted to put up here. This was from about a week ago. The headlines included ex-gang members in El Salvador fear more crime if TPS ends. At least 10 killed in Colombia bridge collapse. Deadly earthquake shakes southern Peru. And rogue Venezuelan helicopter pilot killed by police. Drugs, violence, and natural disasters seem common fare for news feeds from Latin America. And I've always enjoyed what the Colombian writer Gabriel Garcia Marquez said when he received the Nobel Prize Award in 1982. He said, yes, our past has been magical, and there are eccentricities and oddities about our past, but if you look past those, you see real human stories. And this has been echoed more recently by a professor of Latin American history named Brian Owensby. And he noted, quote, if we want to respond to the seeming lack of interest in Latin America, we might do well to look to different narratives. Is there a way in which the default story has become one chiefly of colonialism, exploitation, oppression, and their opposites, rebellion and resistance, of all that has gone wrong in Latin America from a certain perspective, close quote. And so I hope today to address some of the other stories, not in an effort to whitewash the challenges there, but maybe to extend some branches of commonalities with other emerging countries throughout the world. So let me briefly talk about a short-term issue that I think affects all of us. I teach classes on inter-American relations as well as modern Latin America. And this primarily has to do with the uncertainty of U.S. policies towards Latin America at present. I'll talk about the DACA and the Dreamers in my prediction, but we have before us right now the question of NAFTA and its renegotiation that's been taking place in Montreal, a sixth round of negotiations there. And this was negotiated some 24 years ago. I have to remember that not everyone this is now a figment of history, as well as a current event. And I like to point out the broader origins of NAFTA, because it didn't just begin with a phone call from Mexico's president to the U.S. begging for a trade deal. In actuality, it started in 1990 at Davos, Switzerland, another place that's in the news. And Mexico's government was looking for trade deals with Europe so that they could diversify their trade away from the United States, rather than becoming even more enmeshed with dependence on the United States. And while that didn't materialize because Eastern Europe was kind of at the forefront of economic and political change at that point, Mexico and Canada have made the best of NAFTA. And a couple of proofs of this. First was that NAFTA put into place legal mechanisms that have made it much easier for companies not just from the NAFTA partners, but also from Asia and from Europe. You can go to the Ángel de la Independencia Glorieta. It's kind of like a traffic circle in Mexico City. And the European bank towers are, sort of cast a shadow over the American Express building there. And so other regions have taken advantage of the legal provisions that are put in place to make business more transparent, to make the repatriation of profits more seamless. And second, this has made Mexico and Canada much more savvy in making their own business deals, their own trading agreements with other countries. The new NAFTA negotiation rounds were also headlined at the same time that Canada became a partner member in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, something that the U.S. decided not to participate in. And so I like to say that there are still going to be taco trucks on every corner. Thank goodness, but the cost of the beef and the lamb and the tacos al pastor might be going up in the future if the U.S. opts to either bow out of NAFTA, which I don't think will happen. I need to be brief on my long-term concern, and this has to do with something that Professor Hadfield noted, and it deals with the fabric of civil society in Latin America right now. In your lifetime, there was a drastic swing to the left politically in Latin America. The historian John Charles Chastain refers to Latin American politics as a pendulum, and indeed we've seen that. A pendulum usually prevails when you don't have a moderating force in the middle. And that indeed is what we see in Latin America right now, in extreme examples in Maduro's Venezuela, but also in other places like Bolivia and Brazil, which has an election coming up that causes me a great deal of concern. The one bright spot that I see, and this maybe gives my politics away a little bit, is what's happening in Argentina right now. They ousted a populist left-of-center president in their 2015 elections, and Mauricio Macri, who's the more centrist president now, seems to be restoring some faith in Argentine politics and the economy in the global setting. And I think it's going to take time and patience for Brazil, Argentina, and certainly Venezuela to recover from economic tailspins. I'm a little reluctant to make any bold predictions about what's happening in Latin America. I want to say that you ought to talk to your fellow students about their ideas about immigration, because I think it will surprise you. The number of students at BYU who actually have firsthand stories, and this usually comes up in the class I teach on the history of Mexico when fiancés come into the question, and sort of bridging this immigration gap from a legal perspective. So I'm hopeful that the dreamers are going to find a path. There's probably going to be some compromises that will take place there. But to maybe go out on a limb, I'm going to suggest the U.S. doesn't pull out of NAFTA. We all take for granted how much Mexico and Canada are vital trading partners to the United States. And I think that's a relationship, as my graduate advisor who called the two countries Mex-America, is one that cannot be ripped apart without some radical consequences. Thank you.
All right, let's thank our panel for some really interesting beginning comments. As I said, I want to move now and first allow the panelists to make any comments about how the developments and predictions that they see in their individual regions might speak to each other and influence each other, perhaps. And then once that's done, we'll throw the floor open to the audience. We ask that if you want to ask a question for the benefit of our recorded and listening audience, that you come over here and use this microphone here on this side. And if you're a BYU student, please tell us your name and what you're studying.
Okay, I will make some comments first. Some of the things that I think are in question, both the Middle East and Africa, and of course Africa, Northern Africa, is integrated into the Middle East often, is this idea of where do democratic revolutions head, or where do these different political transitions end up going, and sort of the state of democracy, right? What is that? Looking like, and again, as Professor Isom-Verhaaren talked about, how are these places being rated in their state of democracy? One of the places that comes to mind as a great example of the way that people in this African country decided we're done with this dictator is the Gambia. It's one of the smallest countries in Africa, but just over a year ago, the people finally voted Yahya Jammeh out of power. And some of the other countries had to come in and enforce that. He was not willing to leave, but he ended up leaving. And a good friend of mine who was in the Gambia over the holiday season, this past holiday season, he said it was really exciting to be in the country. And he had been complaining about how people had voted for Jammeh. It was not just the military or foreign powers, but the people in the country themselves. And finally, they decided they'd had enough. And so that was encouraging. And so I do hope that ends up happening in other places. But the same with the Arab Spring. We talk about what happened in a lot of North African countries. It's not a guaranteed outcome. So I think that's a similarity, and some things that I'm sure political scientists are talking about. There are definitely world powers that are involved in these places. I mentioned the United States and China, and I think in some ways it's different, although there is that presence there, different from the Middle East and Latin America. But you do have, I think, behind a lot of things, the United States might look at Africa in the news and say, oh, it's just, the Africans are fighting again. It's tribalism again. And it's something that's remote and even exotic. But in fact, business interests and other United States politics are definitely involved in a lot of these places. So it's important to make sure that we recognize that. I'm going to take this opportunity to read something that I didn't have time before, and that has to do with this idea of what kind of news feeds do we get about different places in the world, and how does that affect the way that we look at them and interact with them. And this links to what Professor Ward talked about as far as the news on Latin America. And I think one of the best ways to show how the reality in Africa and Africa-U.S. relations is different from what we see in the news is this letter, an open letter from 78 former U.S. ambassadors to 48 African countries that they signed to President Trump, talking about their reaction to his alleged statement. And I just want to read just a paragraph from this. There's some rich statements here, but they, having spent time in this country, or in these different countries, they talk about their experiences, some were ambassadors in various African countries. So they talk about Africa as a continent of great human talent and rich diversity, as well as extraordinary beauty and almost unparalleled natural resources. And then they say, as American ambassadors abroad, we have seen Africa's complex and rich cultures, awe-inspiring resilience, and breathtaking generosity and compassion. Even as some nations have faced challenges, we have counted among our contacts dynamic entrepreneurs, gifted artists, committed activists, passionate conservationists, and brilliant educators. We learned of novel solutions to complex problems, helped American companies find partners critical to their success, and counted on African military and intelligence officials who often assumed real risks to help achieve outcomes critical to our shared security. So I just wanted to read that because one of the things that I hope we do on campus in Africana Studies is to challenge those negative stereotypes that we have and to highlight too how important it is that we recognize those things in our relationships with other countries and continents.
So I want to talk about the media as well, both from the perspective that Dr. Hadfield brought up and Dr. Ward, both the issues with the media in the Middle East and the issues of the U.S. media, because I think those are both very relevant. So the map I showed you, I got from a website, and I'd never really heard of this website before, so I did a little investigation and found out I think it's a Turkish version of CNN, perhaps, but the other issue is that since the coup, it's now looked at as kind of a source of propaganda. So I'm like, I don't even know how accurate my map really is as to, what's the true state of things. And because a lot of the world doesn't really care, when you're trying to get accurate information, it's really difficult because your sources may be pretty biased that you're relying on, but nevertheless, you have to, do the best you can. But certainly the media since the coup in Turkey has been under attack by the government, and a lot of journalists have gone to prison or have lost their jobs. And so that's an issue. Journalists getting into Syria has been very difficult. Journalists being jailed in Egypt, so that's an ongoing problem. But I think even a bigger problem is the U.S. media and its portrayal of the Middle East, because you would think that all the Middle East is composed of is oil and terrorists. I think if you rely on the U.S. media, which is definitely not the case. I was in the Middle East last summer, and I'm looking forward to spending a year in the Middle East in 6 months, and it's certainly a place which I feel pretty safe in, despite its problems, and it's a place that, as Dr. Hadfield was saying, is full of great resources and great people and great opportunities, and its portrayal in the media I think adds to the problems that we have in dealing with this area of the world. So I certainly would encourage you to go to multiple media outlets for your information on the Middle East, including some from the Middle East, in order to get a more accurate portrayal of the region.
All right, so I'd like to engage in a little audience participation. How many of you had a point in your life, particularly your teenage years, when your parents might have looked and said, whoa, I don't know how this is going to go? I mean, they're looking at you, wondering how things are going to turn out. Are any of you bold enough to admit that that was the case? I'll raise my hand. So the question I have deals with civil society. And what's the incubation time for democracy? And I think it's a common theme that we've all talked about. When I see protests in the street that are nonviolent in Brazil, that makes me think of democracy as well as unrest. We have to look, I think time is a very important element in understanding how civil society evolves and transforms. And so I think in all of these places, there are immediate crises, but we have to also take a long-term view and count as victories the small incremental gains in civil society, wherever it might be.
Questions?
My name is Courtney Kamal Oha. I'm a Middle East Studies and Arabic major. And my question is specifically for Dr. Isom-Verhaaren. In regards to Operation Olive Branch, with Turkey attempting to take YPG territory in Syria, and with the YPG being such a great ally to the U.S. in fighting ISIS, what do you think the U.S. should do? Because in the past, with Turkey and Kurdish relations, the U.S. has kind of stayed out of it because we're allies with both. But in this situation, what do you think we should do?
Okay, well, my expertise is actually the 16th century Ottoman Empire, so. And actually, I don't know that I can answer your question, but I have been very troubled with the erratic, I don't know if we can even call it foreign policy of the current administration. The United States has a long history of pretty erratic foreign policy when it comes to the Middle East, but this has increased recently, and I think it's very difficult for the people in the area to, kind of know how to gauge what the U.S. is really thinking and planning, and so I think your question really gets at just how difficult this is, because there are no easy answers. It's always much more complicated than people make it in terms of the interactions between these various groups of people. So there are some Kurds in this area who are against the YPG, and they're welcoming the Turkish invasion. I'm guessing that's probably a relatively small number, but it just goes to show the complexity. There are Syrians who welcome this, but also Syrians who object to it. And so I guess what I would say is that before the United States does anything, it should think very carefully about making policy and not do it in sort of an erratic, unthought through manner. Sorry, I can't give you a better answer.
My name is Natalie Larson. I'm a history teaching major, and I'll be finishing this year. As a history teacher, I know it's my responsibility to help students become involved in their community, be that the global community. What ways would you suggest that I include the studies of your regions in social studies classes? And what things would you like your students to know before they come to college?
I would say read and read. I could encourage you to send emails to senators, but to gain a deeper appreciation of the content, currently in my life, biography is the way to do that. Get John Lynch's biographies of Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín, and look at the figures from these different regions, not as being limited by the area in which they lived, but as world figures. Not this was an important figure in Latin America. No, this was an important person in world history. Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz was an important figure in the Enlightenment, not an important Latin American figure at the time. And so diving into content is the first and most important recommendation I'd have for anyone that's going to be a teacher.
I would just follow up on this. I think biography really is important, because I think it's important to see people in these various regions as humans, just like us, that we can relate to. And I think biography really does help to read about people and help us to relate to them as individuals.
I would second suggestion to read. That is really important. And to also look for sources and have your students go look for those sources that are from various news outlets. I think that would be a great way to help them see the different perspectives you can get. And one great thing about this day and age is you can go find, there's a website called allafrica.com. You can go there and get all the headlines from every country in Africa that have been there the past few days. And there it is in English for them to have. So I would have your students go out and find that information. In African history in particular, I really like the suggestion to see this as part of world history. And one of the things that I think gets often overlooked is the huge decolonization movement throughout the world in the mid-20th century. Sometimes when I focused on that in my world history classes, students have said, well, you know, we're focusing on Africa too much or on Asia too much. Well, that's a huge population of the world that was under colonization, which, by the way, was not democratic. So when we assess democracy being established in these places, we have to take that into account. But to look at that, have that truly global perspective. And then I would also suggest that all of us, and including, you know, we can have our students do this as well, think of how we are connected to these places through our consumerism. What technologies are we buying that might be causing some unrest in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo, for example? Or where do we buy our chocolate? Is child labor involved in that? Or even certain goods that come from places. I just watched a documentary on Kailash, I think is his name, a man in India who has made it his life's work to go and free children who are in enslaved labor, and so I mean we have a role in that. Where we buy our clothes, why are they so cheap? Where are they made? Those sorts of things are important to think about too.
I'm Andrew Smith. I'm a geography and econ double major, and I was just wondering kind of about the role of regional favoritism by political leaders in a lot of the political unrest that's going on. So a little more specifically towards Africa, I've studied a lot about Seko and his regional favoritism towards his hometown, but just in general, what role that plays.
Okay, so I will comment on that. One of the, again, when we assess what's happening in Africa today, we have to take into account the past, but also not just the colonial past, but decisions that Africans have made since then. But it's important when we talk about regionalism and what we also might term tribalism, is to think about the ways that within colonialism, they gained certain access or they were treated poorly because of that regionalism or that tribalism that was instituted by largely European powers. And so it's important to take that into account. And if you look at, for example, Tanzania, I was there in August, and our driver of the car was telling us, I don't even know what ethnic or ethnicity our president is. And so I think in some places it's not as South Africa would be another place where sometimes it comes into play, but it's really not so much a part of the politics of the nation. So looking at those places and understanding, okay, what is it that made it so that regionalism or tribalism doesn't play a role or does play a role is important. But I think that in the case of Kenya, for example, those things get perpetuated. 2007, at the end of the year when they had elections, we saw a lot of violence, and a lot of it comes from those sorts of alliances and ways that people are rewarded for their loyalty. So that does, I don't know if that answers your question, but it does play a role in a lot of places, but not in all places, and it's important to look at the history of those things.
Sometimes this is really important, as in the Syrian civil war. The Alawites are the supporters of Bashar al-Assad, and the French policies during their rule of the area were divide and conquer, and so they certainly deepened these regional and ethnic and religious differences that were already there. But because Bashar al-Assad and his regime are supported by the Alawites, because if they lose, the Alawites lose everything, they're pretty determined not to lose power. So it certainly has a big impact in some areas and not in others.
Just briefly, there's an article in The Economist in the last few weeks. The column's called Bello, B-E-L-L-O, after a Venezuelan diplomat and writer. And it talks about how nationalism has prevailed in Latin America in contrast to, say, like Catalonia in Spain. And that's an interesting paradox, as one was the empire, and now you have a continent of largely nationalist cultures. There are exceptions.
Jeremy Willey, Political Science and Asian Heritage Studies. My question is for anyone in the panel, but I want to preface by saying I think that probably my success in surviving adolescence was more due to more like paternalism rather than just the incubating of my potential. But so leaving an era of imperialism and colonialism, much of the 20th century can be categorized, well, defined by the U.S. sort of propagating capitalism and democracy. But moving into the 21st century, we're not seeing capitalism or democracy succeeding in much of your areas of the world that you're experts in. And I guess at what point do we see all these people who are voting with their feet, leaving their countries? There's not enough infrastructure or capital or resources for these countries to industrialize. When does what is ample time for this incubation before countries with that capital and those resources start to balance the country's sovereignty and what's safe for the populace?
Well, I'll say that we definitely see capitalism at work in these countries, and that is with the globalization and foreign capital coming in and corporations. And with Africa's rich natural resources, that's where it becomes a real challenge. And you will see these places, I think of the DRC with Joseph Kabila, and that's a huge country with various groups of people who are thrown together to become one nation state upon independence. And the way that companies can go into the country and exploit the resources and get certain politicians on their side is definitely part of what capitalism is, how it's working in some of these places. So it's important to keep that in mind. And that's the paradox in Africa in particular, is that it's so rich with these natural resources, but the way that people are, who is gaining from that is a question. And I think we need to, again, recognize the workings of the global economy and other private corporations in that. And I think, too, in some places, I'll take South Africa in particular, it does have a strong civil society. And it's really important to see that. So like Professor Ward, he mentioned that you can see a nonviolent demonstration that could be considered unrest, but it's also a positive thing when you have people who are out on the streets feeling that they can without, that they have the freedom to do that. So that's an important sign. And I think that the more that we leave countries to make those decisions, not propping up, again, so even after colonialism ended in Africa, there was the Cold War period, and the United States played a big role in propping up corrupt dictators in a lot of these African countries that also, because they were saying they were anti-communist. So looking at that rhetoric too, it's more complex. But if the diplomacy and the relationships we have with these countries will respect more of the autonomy of the local people and allow them to have sovereignty and autonomy over their resources, their natural resources, then that could help a lot.
Do we still have a few minutes? Okay, so you bring up a really important point about mobility. The first sustained wave of migration from Mexico to the United States took place around the time of the Mexican Revolution. And I can't totally answer that question about what impact that's going to have on civil society. But I think time is crucial. If somebody asked me how long it took for the United States to become a cohesive country, I catch my students off guard sometimes when I tell them that, well, it was 1865, that's when it happened. That's like 90 years after the Revolutionary War. It didn't just take Thomas Jefferson coming out with the Declaration and singing a song in a musical. Took some really hard questions being answered. And so that's the challenge, is understanding the meaning of incremental changes and balancing that with the histories of these countries that gained their independence in the 18th, 19th, or mid-20th centuries. So that's a great question.
And I'll be really brief. There's a lot of crony capitalism going on in the Middle East. So capitalism is certainly there, but not the ideal form that perhaps we are wishing we saw more of around the world.
Thank you. So my name is Dalton. I'm a Middle East Studies and Arabic major. And my question is more directed to Drs. Isom-Verhaaren and Hadfield. And maybe it's not exactly your areas of expertise, but do you feel that maybe violent and terrorist activity in Africa, for example, is more ignored than it is in the Middle East? And if so, why? For example, the with Boko Haram, which is associated with the Islamic State in West Africa, or the Al-Shabaab attack that occurred in October that killed upwards of 500 people, and hardly anyone talked about it. Why does there seem to be a discrepancy there?
You can go first.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
Because I took it last time. I do think there are a couple of things going on there. If you look at a map of where the terrorist attacks occur, I think most of them are in the Middle East and Africa, even with more recently with the attacks in Europe. So these countries are, we might look at them as perpetrators, but there are also a lot of victims there. And I think one of the reasons why that doesn't gain a lot of attention is because in some ways, again, how these areas fit in the American imagination is it's just another thing happening in Africa that we don't understand. People dying, and it becomes, I think it's similar to the Middle East. I think maybe the Middle East, and this is where, again, I'm not sure because of my own focus, but I think it probably gets a little bit more attention because of our history and the history of terrorism, our modern terrorism, and it affects the United States more. But I think that in some ways they don't get as much attention in both places as they probably should because of our distance to those places, both figuratively and geographically.
Well, if I understand your question correctly, I think you were asking, why does the Middle East terrorism get more attention than the African terrorism? And I think that has a lot to do with just the general media presentation of the Middle East, that terrorism gets a lot of attention when it's in the Middle East and it's tied to Islam. And so I think I would say it's media bias. That's what I would say, because I think I am under the impression that every terrorist attack in the Middle East gets a lot of press in the United States.